Hello. This video is a follow-up to a video I made a couple of years ago, which proved far more popular than I ever anticipated it would. All of the videos I made around about the same time combined now have achieved around about 70,000 views. One video on its own has achieved over half of that viewing interest, and that's the video I made on borderline personality disorder, which at the time of recording this video has now had over 40,000 views. So it just shows, you know, the other, what was I thinking about, 17, 18 videos, can't remember, round about that. So let's just, for argument's sake, say 17 or 18 videos. One of them has achieved more than the other, you know, 17 or 18 or whatever it is combined. So it shows how much interest there is out there, and no doubt how much searching people with borderline personality disorder are doing in order to understand their disorder. And my experience is also the loved ones of people with this disorder are also looking to learn more about the disorder in order to better relate to the person involved. So what I thought I'd do this time is just, there'll be a little bit of overlap with the last video I made, but I thought I would explore a little bit more depth a significant process that occurs in people with borderline personality disorder, and also, as I do that, highlight loosely two types of borderline personality disorder. They're various subsets, but I'm going to very generally now talk about two types, and that's what's called the acting out borderline and the quiet borderline, or the acting in borderline. And as the names kind of suggest, the acting out borderline is the form of borderline personality disorder that most people generally think about when they think about borderline personality disorder. This is the person that, when something triggers them, will fly into a rage. They might scream, shout, get involved in emotional rough and tumble, spit, throw things, threaten self-harm. All of these kind of things that are commonly understood to be exhibited in a triggering event with somebody with borderline personality disorder. But there is another form, and it's not as commonly known as the more obvious form of the disorder, and that's called the acting in borderline, or the quiet borderline. And the quiet borderline, when triggered, has the same kind of internal rage, the same abandonment fears, and you know, often the same kind of background that leads to the disorder, or makes the disorder more likely. But their response to a triggering event is entirely different. And rather than act out, scream, shout, spit, rage, rough and tumble, they do entirely the opposite. Often there's a politeness, and they will either slowly disengage, politely, or cut straight off and disappear. But rather than raging, they just, it's called the silent treatment, they back away, and they do it silently. It's a form of control. It's in the research seems to suggest it's a form of punishing the other person, and punishing is a very significant factor with both forms of the disorder. It's a form of punishing the other person, because when somebody just suddenly disengages in any, if you like, normal relationship, the person that's being disengaged from, particularly oftentimes these triggers are innocuous, so a person might not even recognise something was said, done, a look was misinterpreted, and the person has been triggered and reacted. So one person might suddenly be left wondering, what on earth has gone wrong? What's happening? As the quiet borderline reacts and punishes the person by creating distance and maybe completely discarding them. So let's look at some of the contributing factors to this. And one of them that I touched on to some degree last time is the fact that people with borderline personality disorder, science seems to be indicating, have differences in the structure of their brain, and two critical areas at least. One is called the prefrontal cortex, and that, if you like, is like the executive function of the brain, at least with regard to managing emotional reactions. And people with borderline personality disorder have differences in the prefrontal cortex, the evidence seems to suggest. And as a result, when they encounter a situation that triggers a sense of abandonment, rejection, criticism. Another part of the brain takes over, and that's the amygdala, and the process is called an amygdala hijack. If you like the terminology, and people talk about this, it's called an amygdala hijack because the amygdala, which is the part of the brain that governs fight or flight response, something scares us or threatens us, and we either run like hell or we fight. That's the part of the brain that reacts instantly to these situations. And in people without this disorder, something might happen that they'll feel uncomfortable with, that might trigger an initial amygdala reaction, but because the prefrontal cortex is functioning properly, you can kind of go, actually, effectively, you're overreacting, or you've misunderstood, or you're misinterpreting it, and it kind of puts a brake, it's a braking effect on the amygdala, which is why, not everybody has this unfortunate propensity to fly into these kind of rages that tend to be more common with BPD. So in most other people, the prefrontal cortex acts as a brake, or acts, if you like, as a higher perspective, and would say, no, that's not a problem, or you misinterpret it, or give them the benefit of the doubt. But in somebody with borderline personality disorder, the trigger happens, and that higher executive function goes out the window, and it's a much more primal response that occurs. And this happens to such a degree that it actually distorts the thinking and often the memory of events afterwards in somebody with borderline personality disorder. So a trigger happens and their perception and recollection of the event is actually inaccurate. But the profundity of the distortion is so great that they don't know that or believe that to be so. And even if presented with evidence to the contrary, in many instances they will reject that evidence outright because of the power of the distortion. So we have an amygdala hijack, and very often what happens in romantic relationships is that then triggers another stage of his cycle, because people with borderline personality disorder invariably, whether they're a quiet borderline or an acting out borderline, go through cycles in relationships. And the first cycle is the idealisation stage. The person they are romantically attracted to becomes their favourite person. They live, eat, breathe, all they can think about is this person, and the feeling of love that they have is all consuming. Then a triggering event happens, and suddenly this person is devalued, and a process called splitting occurs, and that's when the person is split from what they call white, where they're idealised, and they're split to black, and they become demonised, and depending upon how far this process goes, they may then become entirely discarded. The relationship ends. And this is common with both forms of BPD. This process called splitting, whereby at first the person thinks the object of their affection is the most wonderful person probably in the world, and the love of their life. And then a triggering event happens, and the distortion is so great that not only in the now, and not only perhaps with regard to the perceived future, but also with regard to the entirety of the relationship in the past, it's coloured, if you like, black, it's distorted, and as a result, their memory of the person and probably their perception of the person, they would probably distort it and think that what they thought was love was ulterior motive or manipulation or something like that. Something will happen and they'll distort their entire memory of that past relationship. So the person will go from their eternal love to a demon. And then, depending upon the extreme nature, if it becomes very extreme, in the devalue and discard stage, because the person with borderline personality disorder feels that that person is rejected, or is about to abandon or criticise them, and is now, in actual fact, according to them, like a demon, a really awful person, they then believe that person is worthy of punishment, and they will go out of their way. Now, the quiet borderline, very often their punishment is discard and no contact, and the person is kind of left hanging, thinking, well, what happened? 1 minute I was the love of their life, and the next day, gone. Whereas the acting out borderline, because of the explosive nature of the way their manifestation of the disorder unfolds, they are driven to attack very often the person that they've discarded. So they may have physically attacked or sworn or spat or cursed at the person in the triggering moment, but then when they've devalued and discarded that person, they often engage in a process called triangulation. And as the name suggests, there's the person with the disorder, the one-time object of their affection who is now no longer the object of their affection, but rather somebody that needs to be punished, and one or more other people that the person with the disorder draws in. It's a process called proxy recruitment in order to gang up on and attack the other person. Now this form of attack can take this type of attack can take various forms. It can be smear campaigns, whispering amongst friends or public these days with modern technology, the internet. Public smear campaigns. It can be threats, things of this nature. Sometimes the people involved are witting. They are people of not very good character themselves, and they could get caught up in the drama and they want to attack the object of rage. Other times they're unwitting. Sometimes a person with borderline personality disorder might play make out they're in some kind of victim status, and that the person is actually doing them a favour to attack this quote-unquote awful person that they've coloured their ex-partner to be. So it can take various forms, obvious or not obvious. And this can carry on for a period of time because the intensity of the devalue, discard and punish phase can be so extreme that they will they kind of lose control over a period of time, and they just are driven to try to punish that person. So these are two things that really need to be considered. If you're somebody that is in a relationship with somebody with BPD, bear in mind it's practically a given that at some stage, whether it's weeks, months or years, there is an idealise, devalue, discard phase. Now the other thing that's very important to recognise is that many people with borderline personality disorder live in denial, and again that's symptomatic of the disorder. So those of you that watch this that have BPD, who have either recognised it in yourself or even gone to see a doctor or psychologist or psychiatrist, and they've done a diagnosis for you and confirmed that, well done. And you really can pat yourselves on the back, because my understanding is, proportionately, you're a small group within this larger group of people with BPD. Because most people with BPD, it seems, avoid diagnosis. They suspect, they know, they probably may have even encountered, description of it and recognise themselves in it, but they will avoid if you like, officially recognising the diagnosis. And what's more, if a partner begins to suspect or learn something about BPD and kind of raise this with them, that could trigger a devalue discard, because the person with BPD very, very often seeks to live in denial, and if somebody kind of gains some insight, suddenly they can become persona non grata, and they'll be discarded for somebody who is as not yet enlightened. And they'll start all over again. So it's very important, if you think you have or may have BPD, I would suggest to go and see a doctor. Don't hide from the diagnosis, or if you recognise it in yourself, maybe see a trained psychologist or a counsellor, because recognition and acceptance is the first real step on the process of healing and restoring balance. Now, borderline personality disorder can respond quite well to psychotherapy, particularly forms of cognitive behavioural therapy. There's a form called dialectical behavioural therapy. But basically CBT and offshoots of it have shown to be quite effective. But the only way a person achieves that, or achieves that step, is by recognising and accepting. And if you continue to live in denial, not only are you likely to hurt yourself, because this pattern of behaviour is pretty much guaranteed, but one of the things we know with people with BPD, when they're not triggered, they are amongst the most loving, kind, compassionate, gifted people you are likely to meet. And that's one of the saddest things of this disorder, because as they can, if you like, hate strongly, when they love, they can love very strongly too. And my experiences of, my experience of people with BPD, they can be amongst the nicest people you are likely to meet. So it is heartbreaking when a person with BPD lives in denial, and as a result they continue to cycle through idealise, devalue, discard. Idealise, devalue, discard. Or idealise, devalue, scream, shouting, rage. It doesn't reach the discard phase, so you kind of go through a period of a nice time again, and then suddenly there's another screaming and shouting, rage attack. That's not very nice for the person with BPD or the people they live with. So, if you're somebody that's recognised this and have accepted it and are doing something about it, you are in a proportionately small group of people amongst BPD, and you should congratulate yourself. If you haven't got that far yet, it's not for me to tell you what to do and, your life, but I would recommend go and speak to a doctor or a psychologist or somebody that's qualified to, if you like, give you an official diagnosis, either that, yes, borderline personality disorder is an apt diagnosis, or perhaps sometimes there's Okay, my apologies. Sadly, before when I've been making one of these videos, the memory card was full and it cut out. So I'm just going to kind of bring this to a conclusion now. So I was saying, I believe, on the last part of the video, that sometimes there's another disorder that has symptoms that appear to be similar to BPD, and that's bipolar disorder. And the way you find out, of course, is by going to see somebody qualified to help, a doctor, psychiatrist, clinical psychologist, somebody that's able to diagnose, after which you might then go and see a counsellor or a psychotherapist who can work with you. So it's not for me to tell you what to do, of course, but I am going to encourage you to seriously consider, if you recognise any of these behaviours in yourself, seriously think about doing something about it. Because the thing about people with BPD is when they're not triggered, they are amongst the most loving, kind, generous, compassionate, thoughtful people you are ever likely to meet. And I think it's a crying shame that a person who, by their very nature, is kind, considerate, loving and compassionate, should continue to go through this cycle where their relationships, go through these tumultuous events. Very often a person with BPD, after a triggering event, they feel great shame, embarrassment, guilt, self-recrimination. Do yourself a favour. Do yourself a favour and do your loved ones a favour. Join that group of people with BPD that have been bold, and they've stepped forward and they've seen a competent professional, they've got their diagnosis, and they've done what needs to be done. They've gone to see a counsellor, a psychotherapist, and they're working through this. Because I think it's a crying shame if a person that has the capacity for so much love continues to go through so much turmoil simply as a result of avoiding recognising a condition exists, if you like, in an official way, a diagnosis, or seeing a qualified counsellor. And as a result, their life goes from crisis to crisis to crisis. Don't do that to yourself, please. And I would be overjoyed to hear, people contact me as a result of the last video and tell me how much it's helped them. I would be overjoyed to hear if even just one person, as a result of watching this video, who had been, if you like, living in denial, actually took that step forward and got competent help, competent diagnosis, and then competent help. And you might find, like a number of other wonderful people on the internet, particularly YouTube, who actually have borderline personality disorder. They kind of got their own life together, and then you know what they've done? They've gone out and they've made videos, and they're offering counselling, I think, in some cases, helping people themselves with the disorder. And I think that's a fantastic thing. So, in order to conclude, there are generally two types of borderline personality disorder: the acting out and the acting in. Below the surface, they follow the same sequence: idealise, devalue, discard, and they either then punish by maybe triangulation, proxy recruitment, or they're punished by the silent treatment, and maybe an overlap, bit of both, because and acting out borderline after they've punished in an aggressive way, they can then just cut the contact. So overall, the symptomology is very similar. It's just how it's expressed is a little bit different. And again, if there's one thing I can leave, if it's just one person that watches this that's been living in denial, but you recognise this in yourself, please go and get some help, do something about it. Because, to borrow a popular phrase from a television advert, you're worth it. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll talk to you again sometime. Bye bye for now.